Case 1. George Baker, Jr., Father Divine. The hall is already vibrating with expectation when Father Divine enters, moving through the crowd with the serene confidence of a man utterly convinced of his divinity. Followers lean forward as if drawn by an invisible force, their eyes wide with a mix of devotion and awe, convinced they are witnessing the presence of an immortal being in human form. Father Divine doesn't simply approach the front, he claims it, settling into a chair treated with such reverence that it might as well be a throne. Instantly, the room falls into a charged silence broken only by trembling whispers that repeat with chilling certainty, "He cannot die. He is God in the flesh." Those gathered describe waves of warmth and tingling running up their arms, interpreting every sensation as evidence of his supernatural power. When he finally speaks, his voice is calm but absolute, declaring that death is a lie, a man-made illusion that holds no authority over him. For the people crowded at his feet, this isn't metaphor. It is the foundation of their world. In this moment, you see exactly how he commanded such fierce loyalty, how ordinary lives were surrendered in exchange for the promise of immortality, anchored in one man. But behind that atmosphere of divine certainty was a story that began far from thrones and worship halls. Born George Baker Jr.'s Father Divine emerged from obscurity as a wandering preacher with mysterious origins that even his most devoted followers never fully understood. What they couldn't deny was his extraordinary magnetism. By the 1920s and 1930s, his peace mission movement had spread across multiple states, forming disciplined communal households, restaurants, and centers where every detail of life revolved around strict moral codes and unwavering devotion to him. His followers believed he healed illness, eliminated poverty, and manifested miracles through sheer spiritual power, and every testimony led back to the same claim, that Father Divine would never die. Mortality, he insisted, was a failure of faith. He existed beyond it, and those who followed him could share in that eternal state. As his influence grew, so did the rigidity of his teachings. Members were forbidden from acknowledging his age or health. Any hint of doubt was treated as a spiritual betrayal. His claim to immortality became both the cornerstone of his theology and the mechanism through which he gained total control. The deeper his followers were drawn in, the more they surrendered. Families were abandoned, possessions handed over, personal autonomy replaced by complete dependence on the man who claimed to have transcended human limitations. It was a belief system built not just on faith, but on fear. The fear of losing divine immortality by questioning the one who claimed to embody it. Yet outside his tightly managed communities, skepticism was rising. Journalists began probing the peace mission's finances, uncovering vast real estate holdings and communal assets funneled into organizations controlled by his inner circle. Law enforcement pursued allegations ranging from financial exploitation to coercive control. Former members stepped forward with accounts of psychological manipulation and pressure to relinquish everything they owned in the name of spiritual purification. Investigators tried to dismantle the layers of secrecy surrounding his empire, but Father Divine always responded with the same serene certainty, insisting no earthly power could challenge an immortal being. To his followers, every accusation only reinforced the belief that he was under spiritual attack and therefore truly divine. But in 1965, the prophecy collapsed. Father Divine died. There was no miraculous ascension, no supernatural transformation, just the silent, undeniable end of a man who promised he would live forever. The shock within the peace mission was immediate and chaotic. Some followers claimed he had not died at all, insisting his spirit simply shed its physical shell. Others argued he continued in an invisible form, guiding them from beyond sight. A few refused to acknowledge his death entirely, saying it was a test of faith. But beneath the frantic explanations, a devastating truth settled in. The doctrine that had governed their lives had shattered. Without the living presence of the man they believed to be God, the movement's foundation crumbled. Membership dwindled. Properties were sold. Influence evaporated, and for countless believers who built their world around his supposed immortality, the realization was crushing. The man who promised eternity had died like anyone else, leaving behind a legacy of broken faith and lingering emotional wreckage. Welcome to Savage Case Files. If you're drawn to deep-dive documentaries that expose the leaders who manipulated, deceived, and controlled their followers, then you're in the right place. Make sure you subscribe, because we bring you powerful investigations just like this. Stories of faith twisted into fear, devotion turned into exploitation, and leaders who claimed supernatural authority only to be undone by the very lies they preached. Stick with us as we move into the next case, because what comes next is even more unbelievable. Case 2, Sun Myung Moon. The stadium lights burn hot against thousands of faces lifted in unison. Every eye fixed on the man who stands at the center of the platform, wearing a crisp suit and a confident, almost regal smile. Sun Myung Moon doesn't pace or gesture wildly. He simply lifts his hands, and the crowd erupts, not in applause, but in reverent murmurs of recognition. For these followers, gathered from across continents, Moon is not merely a preacher or a teacher. He is the Lord of the Second Advent, the prophesied Messiah who came to complete the mission Jesus left unfinished. You can feel the absolute certainty in the air. People cry openly, convinced they are witnessing the dawn of a new eternal kingdom, led by a man untouched by mortality. In Moon's presence, the belief feels tangible. A Messiah cannot die. A Messiah does not grow old. A Messiah completes his divine mandate before ever leaving the world. Long before global stadiums and mass weddings, Moon moved through small villages and cramped meeting rooms, claiming he'd been personally visited by Jesus at the age of 15. He spoke with a gentle intensity that disarmed listeners, promising a new revelation, a perfected world, a restored Eden. He framed himself as the one chosen to fulfill the failures of Christianity, and for those who felt spiritually uprooted, his conviction was magnetic. By the mid-20th century, his unification church, known worldwide as the Moonies, had become a powerhouse. He amassed followers across Korea, Japan, the United States, and beyond. Wealth flowed in through tithes, businesses, media ventures, and global enterprises. His authority tightened, and the myths surrounding him grew. Moon was not just divinely inspired, he was divinity in motion. He could not die until his sacred mission was complete. Inside the movement, that belief shaped daily life. Followers whispered that his body was immune to sickness. His sermons emphasized a cosmic destiny that set him far above ordinary human limitations. Even aging was portrayed as a spiritual process, not a physical one. Members believed he was protected by heavenly forces, that death simply wasn't an option, until he had restored the world. Privately, some of his inner circle nurtured the doctrine even more aggressively, insisting that his mission's magnitude prevented him from leaving the earth prematurely. The message was always clear. Moon's presence was the anchor of salvation, and his immortality, whether stated or implied, was central to the Unification Church's identity. Critics, journalists, and former members, however, painted a very different picture. Investigations exposed financial controversies, coercive recruitment practices, and layers of psychological pressure. Moon and his organization faced lawsuits, fraud allegations, and intense government scrutiny. He was even convicted of tax evasion in the United States in the 1980s and served prison time, a devastating blow to his claim of divine untouchability. Yet every legal challenge was reframed inside the movement as persecution from dark forces, further reinforcing the narrative that no earthly institution could truly defeat him. His imprisonment became a symbolic crucible rather than a scandal, and his followers held even tighter to the belief that he could not be halted physically, legally, or spiritually. Still, age could not be ignored forever. As the 2000s progressed, Moon appeared increasingly frail during public appearances. His speeches remained fervent, but his body betrayed a slow decline. Many followers quietly dismissed the signs, convinced he would soon unveil a miraculous renewal of strength. Others insisted his spiritual essence was so powerful that physical weakness meant nothing. But the prophecy of a living, eternal Messiah shattered in 2012 when son Myung Moon died from complications related to pneumonia. The impact was immediate and seismic. A movement built around the presence of an immortal leader suddenly faced a reality it had never prepared for. Inside the church, leaders scrambled to reinterpret the event. Some followers insisted he had not died, but ascended to continue his mission spiritually. Others argued he had chosen to leave his physical body voluntarily as part of a hidden divine plan. The most devoted refused to speak of his death at all, clinging to symbolic language meant to preserve the doctrine. But beneath the theological spin, the damage was unmistakable. His passing triggered power struggles, fractured the church into rival factions led by his widow and children, and left many lifelong believers quietly devastated. The sense of invincibility that once electrified stadiums had vanished, replaced by confusion, disappointment, and a painful recognition that the man who was supposed to be death-proof was not exempt from the same end that awaits everyone else. Moon's death didn't just end a life. It exposed the fragility of a belief system built on a promise of immortality, and for many who had surrendered decades, families, and fortunes to a man they believed could never die, the collapse of that illusion became a spiritual wound that would never fully heal. Case 3. Jim Jones. The humid air inside the People's Temple sanctuary felt suffocating long before anyone realized the danger they were in. Jim Jones stood at the center of the room, sunglasses hiding eyes that never seemed to blink, preaching with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. His followers leaned forward as he promised them what no mortal could: invincibility, eternal presence, a life secured by the power of a man who claimed death had no authority over him. In whispers that sounded more like prayers, members described him as the immortal Father, the one whose spirit could not be harmed, whose soul existed beyond bullets, poison, or aging. Every fabricated miracle he staged, every dramatic healing he declared, every dire prophecy he invented, only tightened the belief that Jim Jones wasn't simply blessed, he was immortal. And once people believed the man leading them could never die, surrendering their bodies, their choices, and their futures became terrifyingly easy. Long before Jonestown, Jones cultivated that aura through carefully crafted theatrics. He staged resurrections in front of packed crowds, orchestrated faith healings that left newcomers in tears, and told story after story about surviving assassination attempts that never happened. Followers weren't just encouraged to see him as Christ returned. They were conditioned to believe he was some higher, indestructible force who had come to create a new world. He preached that he could not be killed because he was chosen for an unprecedented mission. Anyone who questioned it was accused of spiritual weakness or betrayal. As the inner circle expanded, so did the myth. Jim Jones wasn't merely a prophet. He was a being beyond the reach of death, destined to guide humanity into a new age of justice and purity. Inside the temple, this belief became a tool of absolute domination. He told members that leaving the church meant stepping back into a world destined for destruction, while staying under his protection meant surviving anything the government or the apocalypse could unleash. He described enemies who supposedly wanted to kill him, insisting that no bullet, no disease, no human force could succeed because he was divinely preserved. That narrative of immortality wasn't just rhetoric. It became the emotional cage that trapped thousands. Families uprooted their lives, abandoned their possessions, and followed him from Indiana to California, and finally to the Guyanese jungle, convinced they were aligning themselves with a man who physically could not die. But outside of the temple walls, investigators and critics saw a vastly different picture. Reports surfaced about financial exploitation, weapons stockpiles, forced labor, manipulation of the elderly, and staged healings designed to deceive the vulnerable. Former members described his growing paranoia, the punishments for dissent, and the rehearsed suicide drills meant to test loyalty. Journalists began digging into his exaggerated miracles, and government officials noted inconsistencies in his claims of being invincible. Each layer of scrutiny exposed how his promises of immortality weren't spiritual revelations, they were mechanisms of control used to silence doubts and maintain dominance. All of that mythology shattered on November 18, 1978. In the aftermath of Congressman Leo Ryan's murder at the Port Kaituma airstrip, Jones ordered more than 900 followers to consume a deadly mixture he framed as a revolutionary act. And in the chaos that unfolded inside the Jonestown Pavilion, the self-proclaimed immortal met the same fate he insisted he could never face. When authorities arrived, they found him dead from a gunshot wound. No divine escape, no supernatural transformation, no survival beyond the grave. The man who once told his followers he could never die was gone, and the world saw the truth his followers had been prevented from seeing for years. The consequences were devastating. The mass death toll became the single largest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11th, and the legacy of his false immortality claims transformed into a global cautionary tale. Survivors wrestled with the betrayal of realizing that the man who demanded absolute loyalty never had divine power, only psychological mastery. Families were left grieving loved ones who believed they were following an eternal leader to safety, and Jonestown became the permanent symbol of what happens when a charismatic figure convinces people he cannot die, only to drag hundreds with him into death's shadows. Case 4. Charles Manson. Long before Charles Manson became a cultural symbol of madness and manipulation, he was already weaving an aura of supernatural invincibility around himself, an aura he used to dominate the young, impressionable followers he gathered throughout the late 1960s. Those who found themselves drawn into his orbit described the same unsettling effect. The way he could walk into a room and make everyone feel as if reality itself bent in his direction, as if he possessed some otherworldly insight no ordinary person could challenge. Manson often reinforced this illusion by claiming that he could not die, that death had no authority over him, and that the universe had chosen him for a purpose too grand, too cosmic, for mortality to interrupt. To the people who lived with him in the desert who dropped their identities to serve him, this claim wasn't a metaphor. It was doctrine. Manson told them he was more than human, a reincarnated Messiah, the returned Jesus in ragged clothes. And he delivered these pronouncements with such chilling certainty that his followers rarely questioned them. His spiritual superiority became the justification for every demand, every control tactic, every command that followed. That veneer of immortality only intensified as the so-called family grew, feeding on Manson's apocalyptic interpretation of the world. He preached that a coming racial war, his delusional vision known as helter-skelter, would destroy society, leaving him and his followers as the inheritors of a new world. It didn't matter that the idea was incoherent. Manson wrapped it in mystical language, coded references, and cosmic warnings that made his followers believe they were living inside a prophecy. The more isolated they became on the dusty ranches he controlled, the more his voice became the only voice, his worldview the only truth. He blurred the lines between spiritual insight and psychological domination, until his followers could no longer separate loyalty to the group from loyalty to the man who claimed he could never die. Under his spell, they surrendered possessions, emotions, and eventually their own moral judgment, convinced they were participating in something eternal. But while the outside world saw only a troubled drifter surrounded by runaways, investigators began piecing together the extent of Manson's control after the 1969 murders that horrified the nation. Detectives traced the brutality back to his teachings, uncovering testimony from followers who described the psychological cage he built around them, one constructed through music, drugs, manipulation, and the constant reminder that he was their immortal leader. Prosecutors revealed how Manson's death-proof messianic persona was not just a spiritual claim, but a weapon he used to command obedience. Former members later admitted that the belief in Manson's divine status made it feel impossible to disobey him, as though refusing his voice was the same as refusing God. That illusion shattered the moment he entered the criminal justice system. The courtroom stripped away his mystique, revealing an aging man without supernatural protection, no cosmic immunity, no divine escape route. Even as he carved an X into his forehead, even as he ranted about destiny, even as he told the world he could not die, the prison sentence closed around him like a cage he could not talk his way out of. For decades he remained locked away, aging slowly, visibly, inevitably, and when he finally died in 2017, there was no spiritual transition, no hidden resurrection, no cosmic ascension, just an ordinary human death that exposed the hollowness of every divine claim he had made. His followers, once convinced they were serving an immortal Messiah, were forced to confront the reality that the man who promised he could never die was never divine at all. Just another manipulator who used the illusion of immortality to take everything he could from the people who believed in him. Case 5. Sergei Torop. Long before the world heard his name, a strange mythology was already forming around the man his followers called Vissarion. Deep in the icy expanse of Siberia, he governed his isolated community with the quiet certainty of someone who believed and convinced others that he had transcended the boundaries of ordinary human life. To the thousands who gathered around him, Sergei Torop was not a former traffic policeman or a failed artist. He was the returned Christ, the embodiment of divine truth, the man whose spiritual authority lifted him above suffering, danger, and most importantly, death. His teachings wove together environmentalism, apocalyptic prophecy, and a messianic narrative that centered entirely on his own eternal nature. To question his divinity was to expose oneself to cosmic consequences. To doubt his immortality was to sever oneself from salvation. And so, for years, his followers lived and worked in the frozen wilderness with the absolute certainty that their leader could not be touched by any earthly threat. His power grew with unsettling ease. Families uprooted their lives and trekked across Russia to join his remote village, believing it to be a sanctuary that would survive the coming apocalypse. Children were raised under strict spiritual discipline, taught that Vissarion's presence was the only path to higher existence. His image appeared everywhere: paintings, shrines, homes, each one reinforcing the same message. This man was not bound by human limitation. When outsiders questioned his authority or suggested corruption within the movement, his followers responded with calm disbelief. How could a mortal institution threaten someone who claimed to operate on a divine plane? How could the laws of men apply to a being who stood beyond the reach of death itself? In this insulated world, Vissarion's supposed immortality functioned as both shield and weapon, ensuring loyalty while silencing dissent. But the illusion began to crack long before the world realized it. Rumors spread of strict control, financial demands, and a lifestyle far more comfortable than the ascetic simplicity he prescribed for everyone else. Former members quietly expressed concern about psychological manipulation and the pressure to view Vissarion as a messianic figure, whose authority must never be questioned. Still, the core belief in his divine protection remained unshaken. Nothing, his disciples believed, could penetrate the spiritual barrier surrounding him. Not disease, not danger, and certainly not the government. Everything changed in 2020. The helicopters arrived without warning, cutting through the Siberian sky as armed officers descended on the community like an invading force. Vissarion was handcuffed, placed under arrest, and flown away to face charges of extortion and emotional abuse. For the first time in decades, his followers watched their immortal Christ fail to stop something he had always said could never happen. No divine shield, no cosmic intervention, no supernatural rescue. Just a man in custody, powerless against the same legal system he claimed he had risen above. The shockwave was immediate and devastating. Some followers fell into denial, insisting his arrest was a prophetic test or that he had allowed the humiliation to teach humanity a lesson. Others broke down entirely, their faith collapsing as the reality of his helplessness settled in. The myth of his immortality, so central to his power, shattered on impact. His imprisonment didn't kill him, but it destroyed the aura of invincibility that sustained his movement. Membership dwindled, communities fractured, and many who had once believed in his eternal nature were left to confront the painful truth. If a supposed Messiah can be dragged from his own sanctuary in handcuffs, then he is no Messiah at all. Sarian remains alive, but spiritually, symbolically, and psychologically, his promise of immortality died the moment those helicopter blades cut through the air. His downfall proved something his followers never imagined they would have to face. The man who claimed divine immunity could be stopped, arrested, and humbled like anyone else. And that realization left scars far deeper than any physical death ever could. Case 6. David Koresh. The tension inside Mount Carmel didn't feel like the atmosphere of a typical religious community. It felt like the pressure inside a sealed vessel, waiting to explode. Followers whispered that their leader, David Koresh, was not just a prophet, but the final, divinely anointed figure who stood beyond ordinary human fate. In Bible studies that stretched long into the night, he spoke calmly, sometimes almost gently, as he explained that he alone held the keys to the 7 seals, and that his earthly body was merely a vessel, shaped by God for an eternal mission. For the people gathered there, men, women, children, his voice carried the weight of inevitability. They believed he could not die until prophecy was fulfilled, that he was shielded from mortality by divine decree. Every choice he made, every command he issued, was filtered through that belief. And because they saw him as someone destined to survive the final battles of revelation, they surrendered to his authority without hesitation. Koresh wasn't an outsider thrust upon this world. He grew from within it. He had entered the Branch Davidian community as a young, intense believer, quickly convincing members that God had given him insights denied to ordinary men. Over time, his interpretations of Scripture became the backbone of the group's identity. He claimed to see the hidden narrative behind the end times. He taught that the world outside was doomed and that only those who remained loyal to him, God's chosen instrument, would stand untouched when the final conflict erupted. These ideas didn't remain abstract. They shaped every aspect of life inside Mount Carmel. Marriages dissolved or rearranged, families reshaped, strict obedience enforced, and all major decisions funneled through Koresh's self-assigned divine mandate. By the early 1990s, he was no longer simply a leader. To his followers, he was destiny embodied. Yet outside the compound, alarm grew. Federal investigators watched the movement stockpile weapons, and reports from former members described coercion, abuse, and a leader whose power seemed unchecked. As scrutiny intensified, Koresh reassured his followers with the same unwavering confidence that no matter what forces surrounded them, he was divinely protected. Death, he insisted, could not claim him before prophecy reached its final climax. His followers held on to these assurances, even as armored vehicles rolled toward Mount Carmel in 1993, convinced that the siege unfolding around them had been foretold, and that their leader would emerge victorious, untouched by bullets or fire. But reality shattered those beliefs in the most violent way imaginable. The final day of the Waco siege erupted into chaos as smoke, gunfire, and collapsing buildings overwhelmed the compound. Dozens of followers died in the inferno, and among them was the man they believed could never fall, David Koresh. His body was recovered in the ashes, unmistakably human, unmistakably mortal. In the aftermath, the prophecy he had woven so tightly around himself dissolved instantly. Survivors struggled to reconcile the spectacle of his death with the promises he had made. Some said the government had prevented prophecy from being fulfilled. Others insisted he had ascended spiritually regardless of what the world saw. But for many, the truth hit with a painful clarity. The man they believed could not die had died violently, leaving behind a legacy of destruction, disillusionment, and lives permanently marked by a promise that was never real. Case 7. Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad's chapter unfolds inside a moment of quiet tension within the Nation of Islam, a movement built on discipline, secrecy, and absolute reverence for the man at its center. For decades, followers spoke of him not as a fragile human being, but as a divinely guided leader whose life and mission were shielded by heavenly protection. In mosques across America, members whispered that Elijah Muhammad was not meant to die like ordinary men, that he was chosen, preserved, and upheld by God for a destiny beyond mortality. This belief didn't come from a single dramatic declaration. It grew through years of teachings, sermons, and the aura that surrounded him. His followers saw him rise from an obscure preacher in Detroit to the messenger of Allah for hundreds of thousands of Black Americans searching for identity, dignity, and liberation. That rise created a sense of destiny around him, a feeling that his life was a supernatural thread stitched into history itself. As the Nation of Islam expanded, so did the belief that Elijah Muhammad operated under a divine shield. Followers repeated stories of visions, prophetic insight, and warnings that seemed to come true. Ministers described him as a man with God-given strength, untouched by the vulnerabilities that plagued the rest of humanity. His authority became unquestionable, and with unquestioned authority came fear. Fear of straying from his teachings, fear of spiritual consequences, fear of disappointing a man believed to be chosen by God himself. Members internalized the idea that critics, defectors, or anyone who doubted him risked not only earthly consequences but cosmic ones, and when he spoke of his mission continuing indefinitely, followers interpreted it literally. The messenger, they believed, could not be removed by something as mundane as death. But behind this powerful spiritual facade simmered growing tensions that would eventually crack the myth. Rivalries within the movement intensified, critics outside the movement grew louder, and the government placed him under increasing scrutiny. Former members began to speak out, some claiming the organization used fear to maintain loyalty, others describing internal struggles hidden from public view. Investigations into the Nation of Islam's activities pressured the organization from all sides, and journalists repeatedly questioned the doctrines surrounding Elijah Muhammad's divine status. Still, none of it shook the belief among loyal followers that he was divinely protected from mortality. Then, in 1975, everything shifted. Elijah Muhammad died of congestive heart failure, and the shock inside the Nation of Islam was immediate and profound. Followers who had spent years believing in his divine protection were confronted with a moment they were never spiritually prepared for. As news spread through mosques and communities, confusion and grief gave way to theological crisis. Some insisted he had not truly died, claiming he had simply transformed into a higher spiritual state. Others argued that his death was a temporary veil and that he would return in a glorified form. But beneath those explanations was an uncomfortable truth. His passing shattered the central assumption that the messenger's life was untouchable. The aftermath reshaped the entire movement. Elijah Muhammad's death created fractures that led to splinter groups, doctrinal rewrites, and a struggle for leadership that permanently altered the Nation of Islam's trajectory. His son Warith Deen Muhammad moved the organization toward mainstream Islam, while Louis Farrakhan later revived the original theology for those who refused to let go of Elijah Muhammad's earlier teaching. But no matter how the branches diverged, one reality remained. The myth of a divinely shielded, death-proof messenger had collapsed. His passing exposed the vulnerability behind the doctrine, leaving followers to rebuild their faith around a leader they once believed could never fall to the same fate as everyone else. Case 8. George Kimbangu, Papa Doc. There was a chilling certainty inside the small, isolated Great 11 commune when followers whispered that their prophet, George Kimbangu, known to them as Papa Doc, could not die. They spoke of him with a reverence that blurred fear and devotion, insisting he possessed supernatural mastery over death itself. This belief wasn't built on sermons or gentle promises. It was enforced through rituals that pushed human endurance far past its limit. Papa Doc maintained control through deprivation, demanding that his followers prove their faith through starvation fasts that lasted days beyond safety and through ordeals he framed as divine tests. His most infamous ritual, the so-called miracle oven, was presented as a transcendent trial, a demonstration that spiritual purity could overcome physical suffering. Devotees were encouraged to place their hands, feet, or entire bodies near blistering heat while chanting prayers he dictated, convinced that their obedience would shield them from harm. Those who hesitated were told their fear indicated spiritual corruption. Those who refused were accused of betraying God himself. People outside the group struggled to understand how anyone could submit to such extremes, but inside the compound, Papa Doc ruled with a mix of prophetic charisma, manipulative theology, and relentless psychological pressure. He surrounded himself with a small circle who reinforced the idea that he was untouchable, a man whose destiny extended beyond humanity. His teachings twisted scripture into warnings. To doubt him was to invite divine punishment. His followers were taught that illness, pain, and even death would pass over anyone truly aligned with his power. And yet, while they were expected to sacrifice everything, comfort, safety, family ties, Papa Doc lived apart, insulated and admired, nourishing the illusion that he existed beyond the suffering he inflicted. When authorities finally took notice, it was not due to theological controversy, but because of the casualties his rituals produced. Survivors who stumbled away from the compound described nights spent without food, days locked in quiet rooms to cleanse doubt, and the terrifying oven rituals that left some permanently scarred. Local officials began connecting unexplained deaths to the group. Investigators spoke to families who had lost loved ones after they disappeared into the Great 11 seeking enlightenment. Step by step, the truth unraveled. Nothing supernatural had ever shielded the followers. The rituals were dangerous, the teachings coercive, and Papa Doc's supposed immortality was nothing more than spiritual intimidation disguised as prophecy. His downfall was as abrupt as it was inevitable. As deaths accumulated and pressure mounted, the Great 11 fractured. Some members fled in fear. Others stayed until law enforcement intervened, and outside scrutiny pulled apart the mythology he had built around himself. Without the carefully controlled echo chamber of the commune, Papa Doc's aura of divine invincibility evaporated. And when he eventually died, quietly, without the dramatic ascension he promised, the last pillar of his spiritual empire collapsed. Followers were left to reconcile the devastating truth that the man who demanded absolute obedience in the name of immortality was mortal all along. The Great 11 dissolved into obscurity, leaving behind only court records, scattered survivors, and a grim legacy of how one man's claim to deathless power became a path that led others to their grave. Case 9. Luc Jouret. There is no slow introduction to the world Luc Jouret created. You're thrown straight into the chilling atmosphere of the mid-1990s, where members of the Order of the Solar Temple gather in candlelit chambers, convinced they stand on the threshold of a cosmic transformation. Jouret, calm and impeccably persuasive, tells them that death is nothing more than a doorway, and that he, along with his most devoted followers, will soon cross into a higher plane without dying at all. He speaks about ascension as though it were a scheduled event, a sacred appointment only the enlightened can keep. Those listening believe they are preparing for a journey beyond the physical world, one that he insists will carry them into a realm free from corruption, violence, and earthly limitations. It is this promise of transcending mortality, not metaphorically, but literally, that cements his power over them. For many, Jouret isn't just a spiritual teacher, he is the cosmically appointed guide who will lead them out of the flawed human world and into a perfected existence. That level of devotion didn't appear out of nowhere. Jouret, once a respected homeopathic doctor with a soft-spoken manner and a disarming smile, slowly blended alternative medicine, New Age mysticism, and apocalyptic prophecy into a belief system that claimed secret knowledge about the universe's hidden cycles. He spoke of cosmic purification, reincarnation on other worlds, and the idea that true followers could escape coming catastrophes by aligning themselves with his teaching. As the group grew, the rhetoric escalated. Jouret began describing himself and his co-leader Joseph de Mambro as figures of spiritual destiny, chosen to shepherd humanity through the next evolutionary phase. What made it dangerous wasn't just the prophecy, it was the assurance that followers were part of an elite circle destined to rise above ordinary death. That promise created a psychological dependence so deep that questioning Jouret felt equivalent to rejecting one's own spiritual salvation. Inside the order, doubt was treated as contamination. Members were pressured to cut ties with skeptical relatives, donate their wealth, and prepare for the coming transit, Jouret's term for the moment they would pass together into a higher dimension. Investigators would later uncover how fear and obedience were carefully intertwined. De Mambro allegedly staged miracles using sleight of hand and hidden projectors to convince members that supernatural forces surrounded their leaders. Jouret reinforced this manufactured mystique by preaching that physical death was irrelevant because true believers would continue their lives in a higher astral plane. The more he spoke of transcendence, the more rituals became secretive, structured, and ominously ritualistic, and privately he warned followers that the world was on the verge of spiritual collapse and that staying behind would leave them vulnerable to dark cosmic forces. The facade began to crack when concerned families contacted authorities about missing relatives and suspicious financial arrangements, triggering multiple investigations across Europe and Canada. Journalists dug into the order's finances, finding that many members had transferred estates and life savings to the organization shortly before vanishing from public view. Police surveillance intensified as rumors spread of an impending mass ritual. But before authorities could intervene, the prophecy Jouret insisted would elevate them beyond death unfolded in the most horrific way imaginable. In October 1994, police discovered a series of ritual murder-suicides across Switzerland and Canada. Fires, gunshot wounds, drugged bodies arranged in ceremonial patterns, all tied directly to the order. Among the dead was Luc Jouret himself. The man who promised transcendence did not ascend into another realm. He died violently alongside his followers, leaving investigators to piece together the mechanics of a cult that had spiraled into a lethal fantasy. The consequences were devastating and far-reaching. Families were left shattered, trying to reconcile the loss of loved ones who believed they were embracing eternal life rather than orchestrated death. Governments across Europe reevaluated how they monitored high-risk religious movements. Survivors described the psychological grip the order had over them, and how belief in Jouret's claimed immortality warped their ability to see warnings for what they were, and in the end, Jouret's own death became the ultimate exposure. The prophet who preached that death could be bypassed died in the very ritual that was supposed to prove his doctrine true. Instead of stepping into a higher dimension, he left behind one of the most haunting examples of spiritual manipulation in modern history. Case 10. Ernest Norman. For decades, Ernest Norman stood at the center of a movement that believed death was nothing more than a doorway he alone controlled. To his followers in the Unarius Academy of Science, he wasn't just a teacher or a spiritual guide. He was a cosmic being who had lived countless lives across the universe, an enlightened entity who could never truly die. He spoke with such absolute certainty about his eternal nature that his followers began to treat the idea of his mortality as an impossibility. They saw him as a timeless presence, someone whose consciousness extended far beyond the limitations of human flesh. Every lecture he delivered, every interdimensional revelation he claimed to channel, reinforced the belief that Ernest Norman existed on a level higher than physical reality itself. In their eyes, he wasn't a man at risk of death. He was a being who had moved beyond it. His teachings wove together science fiction, spiritualism, and metaphysics into a doctrine that promised cosmic evolution and limitless existence. Followers believed that Norman had access to higher realms of knowledge, that he communicated with advanced extraterrestrial intelligences, and that he had already ascended through countless incarnations. The more elaborate the claims became, the easier it was for the group to accept the idea that he was eternally present. He spoke of astral projection, etheric bodies, and universal continuity, and every new revelation made the concept of his immortality feel increasingly plausible within the framework he created. It was never said outright in a single dramatic declaration. Instead, immortality seeped into the belief system slowly, naturally, until the idea that he could die simply didn't exist. Yet behind the cosmic language and metaphysical teachings were the very real mechanics of control. Followers reorganized their lives around him, shaped their identities around his doctrines, and surrendered their sense of physical reality to a worldview in which Ernest Norman was the central figure. When someone believes a leader cannot die, questioning anything else becomes almost impossible. That psychological anchor kept the movement tightly bound, even as critics dismissed the teachings as pseudoscience and investigators raised concerns about the financial and emotional dependence the group fostered. But within the walls of the Unarius community, doubts rarely took root. Norman's presence, confident, imaginative, unwavering, made disbelief feel like an act of betrayal against the universe itself. Everything changed in 1971. Despite decades of assurances, cosmic claims, and declarations of higher existence, Ernest Norman died. The shock was immediate, but the denial was even stronger. His followers refused to see his death as a contradiction. Instead, they reframed it as a transition, insisting his physical body was irrelevant to the continuation of his cosmic identity. They told themselves and the public that he had only shed his earthly form to operate more freely in higher dimensions. Official statements avoided the word death entirely, replacing it with language that maintained the illusion of immortality. But no matter how they reinterpreted it, the physical reality remained. The man who had cultivated the belief that he could not die was gone. The consequences rippled through the group in ways they couldn't fully contain. Leadership strained to preserve the doctrine, membership wavered, and the world outside viewed the death as a collapse of credibility. The very idea that had once bound the group together, Norman's eternal presence, was now the hole they could not patch. His death didn't just remove a leader, it exposed the fragility of the belief system that held the movement together. For many followers, it marked the beginning of a quiet unraveling, a realization that the promises they had built their lives upon were rooted in a fantasy that could not withstand the test of time. When you step back from these 10 stories, a disturbing pattern comes into focus. Every one of these men built their power on the same promise: that they possessed something the rest of humanity did not. Whether they framed it as divinity, destiny, cosmic transcendence, or immunity from death itself, the claim always served the same purpose: to erase doubt, silence criticism, and bind followers to them with a force stronger than logic. Their deaths did far more than contradict their teachings. They shattered entire belief systems, leaving thousands of people devastated, confused, and spiritually adrift. The collapse that followed in each movement wasn't just organizational. It was deeply personal. The kind of psychological devastation that comes when someone realizes the person they trusted with their soul was never what they claimed to be. And yet, even after their deaths, many of these movements continued twisting themselves into knots to preserve the illusion of immortality, because letting go of the myth meant confronting years, sometimes decades of deception. But the question that lingers long after the last chapter is this: why do people keep believing leaders who promise the impossible? What is it about the human desire for certainty, protection, and meaning that makes so many vulnerable to grand declarations of eternal life? And more importantly, which of these stories shook you the most? Tell me in the comments which case hit you hardest and why.